My name is Dr. Robert Farley. I am an associate or an assistant professor at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. With me tonight is Dr. Nick Sarantakes, who is a professor of strategy and policy at the United States Naval War College. Nick has written a book that is titled Dropping the Torch, Jimmy Carter, the Olympic Boycott, and the Cold War. This, as you can probably imagine, is going to be an Olympic version of Foreign Entanglements, and we're going to talk through all of the various political permutations of the upcoming and several past Olympic Games. So how are you doing this evening, Nick?
Doing pretty good. Pretty good. Waiting for London.
Right, now the opening ceremonies are on Thursday, or when are they exactly?
27th.
27th, so that's maybe Friday then.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, obviously your book is about the Olympic boycott of 1980, but I think you also talk a little bit about the boycott of 1984. I guess why don't you frame the issue here of sort of why Carter made this decision, what the politics of the Olympic Games looked like, sort of how he made intelligible this notion that it would be a good idea to boycott the Olympics in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, well, the book is basically a narrative history. I've got a PhD in history, so although I do international relations, I'm a diplomatic historian, and it was something I've always been kind of curious about and wanted to write. And Carter basically came into office very kind of two minds, if you will, on how he wanted to work with the Soviets. And this is kind of represented by the two people in his administration that were his key foreign policy advisors. Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, who basically, for lack of a better way of putting it, basically wanted to play hardball with the Russians. And then there was Cyrus Vance, who was the Secretary of State, who, for lack of a better way of putting it, was a dove to Brzezinski's hawk. That's rather simplistic because Vance was by no means a pansy, but he was, how do I put this, a little more of a professional diplomat. He believed in negotiations. That didn't mean he was necessarily soft, but he didn't think that you needed to have political confrontations and rub the Soviets' nose in the dirt all the time. And
now he would eventually resign in response to Eagle Claw, right? Is that am I remembering that correctly?
Yes, the Desert One. I forget what the code name for that was, but yeah, he resigned over that. Essentially what had happened is Vance had been fairly influential in the first half of the administration, and then Brzezinski started to be more influential in the second half, although it was never quite that clear cut. There was a bit of a zigzagging, to use the term of the time, and there was something of an inconsistency, or at least what seemed to be inconsistent in Carter's approach to foreign policy. So you had, at least early on, you had an administration that seemed committed to continuing détente, the foreign policy approach that had been pioneered by Nixon and Kissinger. And then you start seeing also a desire to throw in other things like human rights, which to a lot of Americans at the time seemed like kind of like a silly idea, but to the Soviets seemed quite dangerous because it seemed like, hey, you're attacking the very foundation of the Soviet state. And that's kind of what makes the Brzezinski-Vance approach a little difficult to characterize as hawk and dove, although I just did that because Brzezinski was pushing human rights, but with the intention of really trying to undercut the legitimacy of the Soviet Union. Right. And needless to say, the Soviets weren't necessarily appreciative of that approach. So you see something of a dichotomy, almost a bipolar would be is too harsh, but not that harsh to describe Carter's approach. Essentially what happened is Carter, like a good leader, wanted to hear a number of different opinions. The problem is that he didn't have the strength of character to kind of control a feud that slowly developed between the two guys and became even more intense between their staffs.
Well, there's a limit. Carter's experience helps show the limit of sort of what people talk about as the team of rivals notion of policy making, right? That you still need an executive who sort of, like most interpretations of Lincoln, was sufficiently strong to mediate and to choose successfully between the contending factions. So.
Exactly. And I mean, one of the knocks that I kind of made on Carter in the book was that, this is a guy who kind of tended to lose focus. He got into the details, and when he got into the details, it's nice, okay, the president, wants to ask some pretty important follow-up questions, but when you're starting to get into the sub-cabinet level proceedings and even 2 and 3 levels below that and issuing marching orders, that creates a real rigidity of policy, and people are like going, well, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this because I got my marching orders from the president, and, he outranks you, so do it. So that kind of, in fact, led to the impression at the time was that Carter was indecisive, and actually I found almost the exact opposite. Is once he made a decision, he really didn't want people to talk to him about reversing it or anything else, although he certainly had that reputation. So you have this situation where you've had the administration trying to pursue détente, and there's a feeling, particularly on the right, that the United States has been manipulated and bamboozled by the communists, and then in December of '79, you have the Soviets invade Afghanistan, and Jimmy Carter's looking for. This seems like a clear breach of etiquette. It's we don't like it when the Soviets invade other countries. We don't like it when they invade Czechoslovakia or Hungary, and 68 and 56 respectively. So, and then needless to say, Carter felt like he was stabbed in the back a little by Brezhnev, and was looking for ways to retaliate. And this is easy to say from a distance, but it's Afghanistan. Who really cared about Afghanistan? And
right.
And the answer is the Victorians of the 19th century, a little, but we didn't really care about it. It was only because the Soviets were there that we cared about it, and we only cared about it afterwards. After 2001 when 9/11 happened. But for the most part, we don't care. But this, in the Cold War, you had to do something, and the problem was that there weren't a whole lot of good options in how to respond to this invasion. And one of the ideas that was thrown on the table was boycott the Olympics. And,
who threw that on the table? Who threw that? From what faction did that come from? Was it just something? Do we know, or do you know?
It came from a couple different sources. It actually came. There were a couple of different voices advocating it, but probably the most influential was a Washington Post columnist by the name of Robert Kaiser, who basically wrote an editorial in the Washington Post and basically said, this is a good way to really smack the Soviets in the face publicly and force them to admit to their public that they've done wrong, and they've invested so much in this that there's no way they can hide this insult. And Kaiser went on a little bit and basically said there's even a possibility that this will, be the process that brings about the collapse of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, this kind of the boycott had been considered briefly in late December, and Kaiser wrote that column in early January, and that kind of revived the issue. And there were other people in the administration, particularly the director of the CIA, Stansfield Turner, who said this is a really bad idea. But and that Turner's memo got to Carter's desk, but so did the editorial, and it was basically what Jimmy Carter wanted to hear.
Right, and this was. This was a very public way, right? There were obviously a variety of private ways in which the United States could respond to the invasion of Afghanistan, and there are a number of private ways in which the United States did respond. But this was something that was so undeniably public. It would show, the domestic constituency in the United States, as well as, at least, for those of you who don't remember 1980, as frankly I don't, these were the Moscow Games, right? So there was no way to not convey to the Soviet public that there was a major political breach here, because these were, the centerpiece of the Soviet Union's presentation to the world in 1980, really. Yeah, and
I didn't find anything. One of the things I found, or that surprised me, was that this essentially was very popular with the American public. I was a preteen. I was 12, 13 years old in 1980. So I wasn't really paying that close attention to it. But what I found is that this was immensely popular with almost every sector of the American public. And it wasn't that Carter was looking for something that would be popular. He just simply needed, it became popular, and it was like, well, that's good. So, and you know, it was a very public way of kind of slapping the Soviets in the face, but it's also something it was not very powerful. I mean, there are a number of ways states interact with each other and try to manipulate the behavior of another state, big states versus small states, or big states versus big states. But this wasn't necessarily going to force them to change their behavior, but it certainly was public enough that it was a stinging insult. So.
Now, domestically inside the United States, I mean, obviously 1980 is the campaign between Carter and Reagan. What was Reagan's, given that this was so popular, what was Reagan's position on the boycott of the Olympic Games?
Well, that's a good question, and it's very tricky because early on, you know, you have, I'm trying to remember, something like 11 people running on the Republican side, and you had Edward Kennedy and Jerry Brown running against Carter for the nomination. And one of the things that at least the Republicans were campaigning on was that he had been weak on foreign policy. And as I said, there's some truth to that, but it's a little more complicated. But, you know, Ted Kennedy basically campaigned against the boycott. Anything that Jimmy Carter supported had to be wrong. And that created even more problems for the Republicans. Carter was finally standing up to the Soviets, and how do you criticize him for that, because he's been weak so much beforehand.
Right.
So, by about March, the Republican race came down to basically George Bush, the original George Bush, and Reagan, and essentially Bush kind of came out and basically was supporting the boycott, which meant he was supporting Jimmy Carter, which is kind of difficult. And there were some actually behind the scenes negotiations between the Carter White House and the Reagan campaign, where they were the Carter White House was actually trying to get Reagan's campaign to join the boycott, which was very odd. And ultimately, Reagan basically came out and said the boycott's a stupid idea, and Jimmy Carter only has his own self to blame if he can't get support for a stupid idea. So it was actually a very clever thing, because he basically said, listen, this is a weak foreign policy president who's ultimately only got himself to blame for the mess that he's gotten himself in, which kind of allowed himself to not support the boycott but not be weak on
right. I mean, right. No, there's an obvious way to paint this as fundamentally a symbolic measure that doesn't save the lives of a single Afghan soldier, right, or a civilian. By doing this, so
which is pretty much accurate too.
Right. So I mean, is that fundamentally your evaluation of the decision to boycott in 1980? That it was basically a mistake.
It was basically useful. It was a mistake. I think the Olympics are, they have a lot of importance and they have some play in world affairs, but it's a form of soft power, and there were some pretty powerful examples in 1980 comparing the Olympics of 1936, when they were held in Berlin with the Nazis, to Moscow, and that was a very powerful comparison metaphor, and a lot of people didn't want to be propaganda tools of the Soviets, and don't blame them for that. There's an interesting quote from that I found and is in the book from an Olympic gold medalist who was on, I believe, the basketball team. I think his name was Sam Glickman. He basically said he was Jewish, and people were telling him, you got to boycott, and other people were saying, no, you got to go, and you got to show what a Jew can do. You got to show what a Jew can do in Nazi Berlin. And he goes and wins a gold medal on the basketball team, and he said, in 1980, even today, I'm still not sure if I did the right thing.
Right.
So that's a powerful thing there, and the opinion polls always supported this. I mean, it was so in one sense it was a popular thing, and Carter didn't do it because it was popular, but the fact that it was popular made it easier to stick with this policy. And it was, everyone, I was surprised, even sports journalists supported this idea. I mean, had widespread editorial coverage, editorial support. I mean, I figured even sports journalists would be opposed to this because it's taking away something that they, would be covering, but they were even supporting it. And
well, and sports journalists are typically closer to athletes, and I know this was not popular among a large number of athletes who only get to do this once every 4 years, right? It tears a hole in their career.
Yeah, and that was probably the only group in America that really opposed this was the Olympic community. And believe it or not, that's actually a fairly small group. U.S. teams are about 500 to 800 people, and you have coaches and administrators, but you're only talking about, it's probably at best a community of about 10,000 people. And you think in a country the size of the United States with 200, 300 million people, that's not a big community.
Right. So Formula One, let's talk just a teeny bit, because I know your book also talks a little bit about the Soviet decision. Now, the Soviet decision to boycott in '84 was effectively just retaliation for 1980, right? I mean, I guess, was there any doubt on the Soviet side, right? Was there any notion that the Soviets should and I have no idea if you know this or not, but that they should be more magnanimous and they should show up in Los Angeles? Or was the feeling just sort of straightforwardly, we are, going to simply return the favor to the Americans in 1984?
Yeah. Well, there are plenty of people who were predicting even in February of 1980 that, it's like, hey, Los Angeles has the Olympics in '84, and guess what you're setting yourself up for?
Right.
And so, there were predictions, even in the middle of the 1980 boycott. The evidence suggests that the decision was made late, about March or maybe even May of '84, and that it had more to do with the changeover in who was running the Politburo. I believe it was Chernenko or Andropov was, I forget which was which, but basically Andropov and then Chernenko, basically one dies and one takes over, and I believe it was Andropov who died, and Chernenko took over, and Chernenko was close to Brezhnev, and basically this was a way of teaching Ronald Reagan a lesson. Mm-hmm. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. The Soviets learned the wrong lesson from 1980. I would argue that the right lesson, and all the historians watching this are probably cringing because historians are always told there is no real right lesson. Right. But the right lesson of 1980 is that the Olympics have a magic all their own. And if you look at what was going on, and you don't have to look very far, you can just look in the old issues of Sports Illustrated or in news coverage of the Olympics. It was the Olympics. People were having a blast. World records were set. The number of world records was roughly equal to the number of records that were set in Montreal. So the Soviets learned the lesson.
Can I pause you for a second? What was TV coverage like in the United States of the '80 Olympics? Was there still the same degree that there had been 76? No. Okay. All right.
There was no coverage. NBC made a decision.
Oh, really? Okay.
To basically said, if there is no U.S. team, we will not go, or we will not cover it. So there was no TV coverage. Now there was coverage elsewhere, the BBC and stuff like that. But NBC and they had an insurance policy that basically said it was kind of interesting. If there's no U.S. team, they would get their insurance would kick in and they'd get covered for this. Mm-hmm. So NBC basically continued to make payments as they were legally required to the Moscow committee, but essentially they said no U.S. team. The American public's not interested. We're not going to telecast it. So they took a bath on that, where they lost about $80 million. Of course, they ultimately, I guess, Lloyd's of London took a bath on it, but there was no domestic TV coverage.
Right. Okay.
But basically the Soviets the lesson they took from this was the Olympics need the Soviets. So in '84 they basically say, okay, we'll teach you a lesson. No Soviets. Well, we didn't really miss them in '84. We had a party, and it was like, wish we were here, but who cares? We get more gold medals. And I kept wondering. I mean, even in July and August of 1984, I kept wondering, well, if we're having a party and we really don't care that they're here or not here, how did they feel? And the answer is they were having a party and they didn't really miss us either. I mean, their guys won gold medals and they were Olympic gold medals, and there was a pretty good diversity in who won. And basically what I argue is the Olympics have a magic all their own, and despite the boycott in 80 and 84, the people who were there still had a blast, and it was the Olympics in the story.
Right. So we're going to get back into this, to the sort of the competitive medal aspect in a second. We're also going to talk a little bit about the party aspect in a second. But how I remember the Olympics in, and this was, of course, the Winter Games in 80 and 84, and then the Summer Games in 88. But there was also, for those with long memories, there was something called the Goodwill Games that came in 86 and was sort of a supposed to be, it was like Ted Turner's Olympics. And this was the first time that U.S. and Soviet athletes had been on a really big stage. But the feeling I remember from 88, and why, not just myself, but I think other people have argued that the Cold War games were so much more fun and interesting than the Olympics we have today, is that it really felt like you were bringing together the best that the Soviets and the Americans had to offer. And so, more than just track and field and more than just, obviously, ice hockey and basketball and everything else, what you had in these games was the competition, the non-violent competition between two systems of governance, right? And, of course, we know now that the Soviet system was rotten to the core and so forth, but there was something so exciting about that understanding of the Olympics, that it was, that it was a bipolar world, and fundamentally, they had the East Germans and the Romanians, and we had the West Germans and the British and the Australians and so forth, and the Chinese were, as the Chinese always are, doing their own thing. But there was this geopolitical significance to it, that the Olympics, they're fun, it's a party, people watch, I'll watch part of it, but we no longer have something like, there is no longer any sort of analog to a U.S.-Soviet basketball game or a U.S.-Soviet hockey game or anything along those lines. And the Olympics, and I suppose you could say that maybe in the modern Olympics we are starting to get a little bit of that back in terms of a U.S.-China rivalry, the women's soccer and so forth. But that fundamentally, but even then, right, it's not understood as, maybe then it's civilizational competition, but this notion that here are two different ways of living, and here are how these systems produce the best of the best, and then let's pit them against each other and see what happens.
There's a lot to that. I mean, you can compare like the hockey, the Soviet U.S. hockey game in 1980. That was the first round of the playoffs. It was not the gold medal game.
Right.
And the United States beats the Soviet Union, and that was an incredible game. I mean, because essentially what you have is a team of all college all-stars, not even necessarily the best all-stars, but a group of kind of amateurs, legitimately amateurs, versus the best hockey team on the planet, professional, amateur, whatever. I mean, just think about how the nation was wrapped around that. I mean, we've had 2 movies made about that event. I mean, it was monster popular. And then, I mean, those guys, are all in the Hall of Fame for the Hockey Hall of Fame for that win, even though a lot of them don't really go on to do much more than that. Some of them actually have pretty good professional careers, many don't. But compare that to the U.S.-Canadian game of the last Winter Olympics, which was an exciting game. But, it was like, it was a good game, but it wasn't, it just didn't have that kind of, it didn't resonate with the American public the way, I mean, I don't know how it resonated with Canadians. I'm sure since they won, that probably meant a lot more to them than us. But it was a great game. But it's like, okay, whatever. We didn't win a gold medal.
Right. Well, and the Soviet analog of the 1980 hockey game is the '72 basketball game, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Where they win under very controversial circumstances, and of course the silver medals are still there, and the American teams never picked them up, and so forth. And so
exactly. And those basketball players in the '72 team. I don't know if it matters or not, but none of them go on to be very successful in the NBA. Although the NBA was not quite what it is today, but in the 1980 Olympic hockey team or basketball team doesn't have much success either. And although their tryouts and all that, and you have people. Only I think significant person on the '80 team was Isaiah Thomas, and So, these guys don't really.
The '84 team that won gold in Los Angeles had David Robinson, and
it had Jordan. It had. I'm just going blank on all the names. I remember Charles Barkley did not make the team. Wayman Tisdale of Oklahoma was on that. Chris Mullins. Trying to remember. It was almost who's who of the NBA in the '80s.
Right.
So they go on to do a lot on that team.
No, I guess Robinson was 88. That's right. David Robinson was 88.
Yeah, I think he was just a little younger.
Right.
I'm trying to remember who else. I mean, Jordan was obviously one of the biggest names, but there were a lot of other people who I'm just going blank on at the moment. But that was almost a dream team before there was a dream team.
Right.
But a lot of people who were played in the pros and won medals and stuff like that. So, in the IOC basically kind of was proud of itself, particularly in the Cold War, where they were like, hey, the diplomats and the politicians can't get along, but look, they basically forced the two Germanys to compete under as one team for a while. They had some success with the Koreas, so they had more success kind of in saying, okay, we're going to put aside these differences, we're going to put aside these political divisions, and we're going to.
When was the last time that the Koreas played together as a team?
I want to say '68.
Oh, really?
I think that basically in the 50s and 60s, both the Koreas and the Germanys had to compete as one, and eventually they basically said that ain't happening.
What about the Chinas? Did they ever have Republic of China and PRC compete together, or?
No, essentially the China situation, and that's kind of another thing, is that there's no consistency to this, but essentially the PRC walked out of the Olympic movement, and that really bothered the IOC because you can't hear you saying you're a worldwide movement and you have a fourth of the planet not taking part. Right. So the Republic of China, the nationalists, the people who lost, Taiwan competed as China until I think 60, and then they had to compete as Taiwan, and then they were eventually forced out. I believe 72 was the last time they competed, and then they were out of the games for about 8 years, and then they were allowed to compete as kind of something called Chinese Taipei. So they compete now, but they have to basically call themselves something different. Although the interesting thing is, in the official languages in the Olympic movement are English and French, but the IOC, the Olympic Committee, basically told the nationalists on Taiwan, you got to change your name. So they call themselves Chinese Taipei in English, but if you go look at their website in Chinese, they still call themselves, the Chinese National Olympic Committee. So in Chinese, so. In their official English name, which is all the IOC cares about, is what they want it. And in Chinese, they still call themselves what they've been calling themselves. So,
right. Right, and I guess So to move on a little bit from, because one of the most exciting things for me in 1988 was counting up the medals for each side, and of course, the Soviet Union came out ahead. In '88, and I think the Eastern Bloc as a whole, because the East Germans obviously also had a very formidable team. I sent you an article called Medalball. And it appeared on Nate Silver's blog at the at 538, his New York Times blog. Although I can't remember if he wrote it or not. But anyway, it talked a little bit about how countries try to game the system in order to win gold medals. And we can sort of talk more about soft power and so forth and smart power and so forth. Why is it so important for countries to devote so much resources to winning a gold medal in often in sports that no one cares about? And why is this such a relevant thing for countries? And which sort of leads back into the previous question, which is, why did the United States and the Soviet Union have so much interest in devoting tremendous resources to trying to win lots and lots of gold medals?
Yeah, it's It's something, it reflects something, a bit of a sports culture and national culture. I mean, if you had suggested to the Carter administration that you boycott the World Cup, I mean, that would have had no impact on.
Will anyone notice? Will anyone notice? I want to return to this actually in just a minute, but I'll go ahead and finish your thought.
Well, essentially, it's like, for us, and in fact, the comment was made in 1980 by Lord Cullonan, the president of IOC, who said, if we played baseball, which was not an Olympic sport at the time, or football, American football, you guys would be here. And, that was probably not exactly the best thing for him to say, but it got to a point where he was trying to get at something. It's Americans don't understand world sports, and there's something to that because if Carter had been told to boycott the World Cup, I mean, assuming that the United States had even been in the World Cup at that time, that would have had a different impact on the world, or at least resonated differently. But a lot of countries compete in this thing more for prestige. I know a lot of countries have an Olympic committee, even though they really don't have Olympic caliber athletes, just so they can say they have an Olympic committee. And you see that in a lot of places. And the interesting thing about all this is, even today, the Olympics is primarily a European phenomenon. All the countries that the dominant powers are in Olympic sports are basically European countries. The ancient Olympics started in Europe. The modern Olympics started in Europe. London is hosting the Olympics for the third time. That's more than Asia, Africa, and Latin America put together. So, there's something of a prestige issue. You can compete with the big boys, and there's some countries that have really strong niches. Kenya, for example, produces a lot of runners. Australia, is really strong in swimming. They are really weak in Winter Olympics, but so it's basically a matter of prestige. You can say at least you're competing in that, and member of the United Nations, member of the World Olympic movement. You have a team there. You guys have guys that carry the flag and.
Right. Well, and there must be, especially for sort of the small, and I think that the article talked, the Medalball article talked about Kazakhstan, and also talked about some of the other Central Asian countries. I mean, it's a moment where if you win the gold medal, your man or woman is up there and they're playing the national anthem, and in terms of Kazakhstan, the correct national anthem, presumably, and it's a moment of prestige that matters not on the international stage, but also presumably domestically. I mean, I've never lived in Kazakhstan, but I would imagine that these athletes are paraded around fairly substantially by the powers that be in these countries in terms of demonstrating. And I don't think that this is limited to autocracies. I think it's probably also something in terms of the democracies. You find the same thing. That certainly you see it in the United States, right? I mean, you see it in the United States to some degree. But these are symbols of national power and arrivedness.
Yeah, and there certainly are good examples of that. One an example, and I'm going blank on the name, was a Korean marathoner who won in the 32, but he was competing for Japan, and he's a national hero in Korea. He had to compete under a Japanese name, but essentially he's a national hero in Korea because he won a gold medal. So it certainly plays that way, and there are still plenty of the United States is this dominant power, but there are plenty of sports that we don't really do very well. I mean, despite the fact that almost every high school in America has a track and field team, that's basically what you're doing when football and basketball aren't in season. And I share an office with a guy who competed for the Netherlands in the 84 and 88 Olympics, and his girlfriend won a gold in Madrid, or Barcelona, excuse me. And he said, if you guys actually had good coaches who actually understood, running, you would just, dominate, the sport, And there are plenty of other small sports that, like archery, that the Americans, or the hammer throw, which is a track and field event that we've never done very well in because, we are an Olympic power, but it's kind of like because of sheer size in some sense, because there are enough people who care about certain sports, but it's rowing crew. I mean, how much of a national following does that have in the United States?
Well, I mean, apparently those two guys who came up with Facebook, who they look alike, and I can't remember their names, but anyway.
Yeah, the
Winklevoss twins.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, Winklevosses. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah.
I mean, I actually have to go back here. I mean, I am going to hope, as a University of Oregon alum, that you were not implying in any way that Olympic coach Bill Bowerman, who of course was an Oregon Duck, was in any way insufficient. Oh, and I hope that no one would ever say that about an Oregon Duck. So
no. We've had. I mean, obviously, you don't win as many gold medals as the United States has without having some people. But it's not like if we were. I don't want to be knocking my country or knocking the USOC because these are good organizations, but and I like my country, but sports cultures manifest in certain ways. And for example, if you want a defense, this is probably one of those sports where you don't have to worry about the United States.
Well, I mean, we have never established a machine in the same way, and this gets back to the issue between the United States and the Soviet Union, right? That we never established a machine in the same way that the Soviet state was capable of just sort of by its nature, right? And that was, again, what was so appealing about it, right, was that the Soviets had a machine to create athletes.
Yeah,
and this was sort of, I think this was almost parodied a little bit in the classic film Rocky IV, where they have the boxer. But that, I mean, it was geared to producing elite athletes, and other Soviet bloc states were the same way, right? And that was sort of so fascinating about the relationship between the two countries during that period.
Yeah, well, yeah, all the guys on the Soviet hockey team in 1980 were lieutenant colonels in the Soviet Army, and their job was basically to play hockey. Go out and command an infantry battalion for 30 days, and then come back and play hockey. It was not really their full-time job was being hockey players, and for the most part, you're absolutely right. The communists had a much more systematic way of basically exploiting their human resources, or exploiting and using or promoting their human resources. Although exploiting might be the right word.
Exploiting might be the right word.
Exploiting probably the right word. But in the United States, it was kind of more, kind of a side effect. I mean, it essentially had a professional system in everything but name versus an amateur system, and there are certain advantages and disadvantages to each one. So,
all right. So two questions, and one is forward-looking, and one is backward-looking. I'm going to ask you the backward-looking one first because I think there's probably a fairly short answer, and it goes to a little bit of what we've been talking about. Why is it that, given the international relevance of soccer, or as they know it in other countries, football, why is it that neither the United States or the Soviet Union fielded internationally competitive teams during the Cold War? Do you have any insight into that? I've wondered this a long time, right? Why there wasn't just a tremendous devotion of resources on both sides to fielding internationally competitive teams?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't have a really good answer for it. I personally played soccer in the 70s when I was a kid growing up, but it was, and you would think it's not that hard, but at least to some degree, I think it doesn't translate. The sport is fun if you play it, but it doesn't translate well onto television. So I think it's hard to develop a fan base or a consumer base. Obviously there are fans today, and there are plenty of fans in Europe and stuff like this, but it's a sport that, it's not like football or basketball, which translates very well into television. And most of the professional football games I've seen have been on the television. I don't think I've ever seen a pro game in the stadium.
Right. There was certainly a developing interest in soccer in the United States. I remember watching the Brazil game prior to the last World Cup at the gym, and when the United States scored a goal, people were cheering, right?
Yeah.
And so it wasn't just me that was watching it; other people were watching it as well. So,
Yeah.
well, I mean, that sort of explains. I mean, that explains it, sort of the American side in the context of consumer culture, right? But why did the Russians never really developed an impressive soccer armada? I guess.
That's a good question. I mean, it could.
There's open space in Russia, presumably.
There's open spaces, and it's a sport that you can play, all the time. They do very well at hockey, which is actually a sport that's developed in North America. So it's not, it's just the culture of it seems to be primarily in Western Europe, although it's certainly done well in Latin America. So, I'd be really I'd be guessing at something. Although I guess now that I think about it, probably the best guess is that for a long time the Soviets were suspicious of sport. It was kind of the according to a lot of official communist arguments, particularly in the 20s and 30s, it was basically something that was developed by the capitalists to keep the working man, kind of contained and content, and it was keeping their mind off stuff. So, since it was so popular in Western Europe among the workers, it might have been just a little bit too far ideologically for them to go.
Do you know when the Soviets, when did they first start participating in the Olympics? Do you remember? Do you know?
The Soviets first started competing in the Olympics in *48.
Okay, so I mean that's a pretty substantial distinction between
48 or 52 actually. I might be wrong on 48. I'm going blank. I think they sent a team. Fairly certain they sent a team to 48, and then I think they finally joined the IOC and all that in 50, and so, but after World War II. Right.
So a pretty substantial distinction between sort of the very isolationist Soviet foreign policy of the mostly isolationist Soviet foreign policy of the 20s and 30s to the more internationalist outlook of the post-war. All right. So my second question. Are we looking toward a future now where the People's Republic of China has certain advantages in the world, one of them being that it has far more people than anyone else, and two, that it has a form of this Soviet system, right, where you have a very state-oriented system. Maybe not in 2012 and not in 2008, where the United States, to my recollection, still led the medal count. But are we looking forward to a period in which sort of as far as the eye can see, the People's Republic of China is going to lead the medal counts in every Summer Olympics, exactly. Not necessarily the winter, but in the summer.
Yeah. The Winter Olympics is still dominated by kind of the Scandinavian countries, and that's even more of a European phenomenon. As far as that goes, my guess is that China is going to be, in the top 10, probably top 5, but United Germany, I think, is going to be very strong and has been strong. China, they have the advantage that they have the numbers, but and they have a system where they can kind of divert people there, but it's not the most efficient of systems. So, and for example, Sports Illustrated predicted that made this prediction. Way back in 87, 88, that China would be the new athletic power, and it's taken them a very long time to reach that fulfillment. In fact, they made that prediction, Sports Illustrated did, and then South Korea won more gold medals in 88 than the Chinese. They won a lot of medals in the last Olympics, but that's because they were the host country.
Right.
Every host country. They have the home turf, and they automatically qualify for all the sports that all the team sports and stuff like this. So I think just because of the size, they're going to be in the mix, but it's not the most efficient of systems. I mean, the bird nest is basically no longer suitable for what it was designed. So they're going to be in the mix, but I don't necessarily believe that they're going to be the dominant power. What'll be interesting to see is particularly when the Olympics go to Brazil in 4 years in 2016, whether or not the Olympics start really kind of spreading into Latin America. I mean, the Latin American teams have always had, or Latin American countries have always had teams and they won medals. But if you ask them what's more important, they'd say the World Cup. So it would be interesting to see what happens if you can see some of these big powers. I mean, Brazil's got a lot of people. Argentina, has a lot of people. It'd be interesting to see what happens if in 4 years, and see if Latin America starts kicking in, and if you can start seeing some African countries really start producing teams as well.
Right. So, I guess moving on from this, and sort of, I like how we've talked a lot about sort of the national relevance and the relevance to national power and politics of winning a bunch of Olympic medals. And so, sort of the obvious question comes up next: why then would certain countries ever? And so, China doesn't do this, right? Soviet Union didn't do this. East Germany didn't do this, right? Lots of medals were won during the Olympics that all of those countries contested by women. Right,
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, there have in fact a number of cruel jokes about East German women. Right, I mean, I remember particularly The Simpsons, where I think Kent Brockman, East German women, he held up quotes. But that say what you will about East Germany and the Soviet Union, right? They understood the value of putting forth a certain vision of socialist woman, right? Mm-hmm. And China understands the same thing, right? Yeah. But, and this has been a fairly big story about the Olympics, this will, as I understand it, be the first time that Saudi Arabia has submitted a women's team. Mm-hmm. And I know less about the other Islamic countries, but, it's very interesting that domestic politics, and I know I'm contextualizing religion in a political way here, but other secular Arab teams have sent women before. So it's very interesting that this is such a big deal that the Saudi Arabians are sending women for the first time.
Yeah, and it's interesting because essentially what you're dealing with is a European phenomenon. The Olympics start there, and you go back a few years. There's supposed to be an amateur competition, which is a very British idea. You're not going to have professionals get paid for this, and that has basically gone away. Because now you have the NHL and the NBA sending their stuff.
And we should say briefly. I mean, I don't know what your attitude is, but my attitude is that that's fine, right? The fact that that's gone away is absolutely fine. The Olympics should be about the best athletes, not the best amateur athletes.
Right.
For the reasons I think that you made on the Soviet point, right? That depending on your social system, amateur can mean many different things. So.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that was the other thing is, IOC was basically judge, jury, and executioner, and they kind of chose to look the other way, even though the Soviets and the Communist bloc during the Cold War was basically violating the letter and the spirit of their rules. Mm-hmm. And they said, no, they're not. But on the other hand, they really did they looked at how the communists were using, sport for youth development, and they really liked that. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't quite as hypocritical as it might seem at first blush. But, it gets to this issue of, the Olympics say you got to, the IOC says, this is the Olympics and this is how we're going to compete and all this sort of stuff. It sounds fine, but these are, and some of these things are issues I don't have any problems with, but it's you certainly butted heads and with a number of countries on their social systems, and South Africa got kicked out of the Olympics for 20, 30 years because they would not they produced a segregated team and would not allow their black citizens to compete. A lot of countries have problems sending women for social and political religious reasons.
I mean, what are the other countries? Well, beyond Saudi Arabia, do you know what are the other countries that have issues sending women?
I would imagine that. I think Saudi Arabia is the last country to give in on this, but I would imagine that a number of the Middle Eastern countries basically are not sending large contingents of women athletes. So, Iran, Qatar. I don't want to pick on anyone in particular, but this doesn't play quite as well in some countries as it does in the United States, and this reflects, in fact, I should point out the first. The ancient games were an all-male thing, and when they originally brought back the Olympics, if you buy what the IOC says revived the Olympics. The first set of Olympics in 1896 was an all-male thing. They didn't really have women athletes until 1900, the second modern Olympics. So this is it gets into issues of globalization. Whose rules are you going to play by? Because guess what? The rules are different in different places, and if you want to be part of a global system, you kind of have to agree to a set of rules that might not necessarily be what you want. So,
Right.
And I guess the Saudis said we'll play by these rules. They're sending like 2 athletes, and neither one of whom really lives in Saudi Arabia anymore. So
Right.
I think one lives in California, who goes to school somewhere there. So they're been
Right now, I mean, I remember the Saudi Little League team. I watched a sort of the international division in the Little League, and all of them were the children of American engineers, which was fascinating. So, and I think this is probably going to be our last topic, but the question of Saudis sending women finally, I think, leads inevitably. There was a very interesting article. And again, I can't remember exactly where it came out of. Maybe the Atlantic or somewhere, I can't remember. But about sex at the Olympics and sex in the Olympic Village. Mm-hmm. And I guess to phrase it carefully, there is either an appalling or a very titillating amount of sex in the Olympic Village during the 2 weeks of the Olympics. Right.
Yeah.
And in this article, someone estimated that 75% of the athletes are basically hooking up with other athletes. There's a variety of ways to approach this issue, right? One is oh my God, that's a fascinating thing. Another which, that's why the Saudis don't want to send any women. And what are the Saudi men doing while they're there?
Yeah.
There was an interesting story in this article about Greg Louganis, who basically hung out with all of the Soviet men during this period. I guess he sort of came to appreciate his sexuality while he was an Olympian. I guess what were your thoughts about this article?
Well, yeah,
it was a fun article. It was a really interesting article.
Yeah, it is, and in some sense, there's nothing new to this because I've certainly heard accounts of this before. And how much of this is just story and urban legend? I believe that essentially the story is accurate. Right.
The argument is you basically have lots of 20-somethings who have incredible bodies and who are eating tremendous amounts of calories every day, have all this energy, and are blowing off stress at night, which does not seem implausible if you've hung around 20-somethings. So. Yeah,
that's exactly right. These are amazing athletes who are in incredible shape, and who appreciate the bodies of other athletes who are in incredible shape. And, it's, why do people have sex? It's like there are a number of reasons, and one of them is...
Why do people have sex? I think Blogging Heads has not tackled this sufficiently. Why do people have sex? Right. Okay. So anyway, go.
Well, for one reason, it's fun. But it's in one sense, it's like, okay, this is part of the Olympic spirit, the world coming together, and having peaceful cooperation, all this sort of stuff. It also gets to another thing. It's like, well, if people are saying there's questions of morality here, people who are worried about questions of morality, and those are legitimate issues, and those can play out on large scale, particularly when public loses its spirit, etc. Or how they conduct themselves, and there are all sorts of stories about this. If you can go back to ancient Rome, there's an argument that that's one of the reasons why Rome fell because they became too decadent. So there might be something to that, the thing about stories about sex is they're really great stories, and sometimes they get better with telling. So, although I believe there's an essential element of truth to this, it might not sound like, it might not be a real orgy the way, there certainly probably are people who hook up, but I also know that serious relationships that end up in marriage come out of this stuff as well, and there might be interaction, social or romantic interaction, that becomes far less than, an unabashed Roman orgy. You might spend some time chatting with someone from Australia who competes in the same sport you do, or a similar sport, and you have like interests, and it's a small community. I mean, we were talking earlier, it's probably only about 10,000 people in the United States. Well, extrapolate that a little further, it's still a pretty small community, and if you've been put going to college on hold, or put a lot of other career plans or life plans on hold, you can interact with someone who might have been doing the same thing, who perhaps, because, although they're Australian or Canadian, can understand those sacrifices. So, so there's a lot to this, and it's a lot of multifaceted things to consider.
Right. I mean, it's also interesting that whenever there are situations like this, and we can make an analogy to a typical college campus, which has people of roughly the same age group. There are also always issues of sexual assault, right? I mean, this is on a college campus, and I know, for example, the United States Naval War College is not a typical college campus, but University of Kentucky is a pretty typical college campus, and there are issues of sexual assault on campuses. There are in all major public universities, and yet I do not recollect off the top of my head any sort of major allegations coming out of any Olympic Village about sexual assault, right? And the reason for that could be that there's never been a sexual assault in the Olympic Village. I have my doubts that that's the actual answer, right? Yeah. And so there's a negative side to this, right? That remains unexplored.
Yeah. Statistically, that seems unlikely. Although that's not impossible, but I'd like to believe that, but I wouldn't put much money on it. So I mean, these are also things to consider as well.
Right. All right. Well, this has been, I think, a fabulous Blogging Heads to start off the Olympics with, and so everyone, please enjoy your Olympics, which happens this year to involve most of the major countries. Right. Nobody's boycotting, as far as I know.
I don't think anyone is. What's surprising is most Olympics, basically there's a boycott about every other Olympic. Some of them are pretty tiny and people don't really notice. It's like Indonesia boycotted the 64 Olympics. Who noticed? Who cared? North Korea boycotted the 88 games. Who cared? So I think the big political display for London has already taken place, and that was the bombing of the train system the day after they were awarded it. So I suspect that you're not going to see anything like that. Hopefully the Olympic athletes that were killed in '72 will get some kind of honor. Moment of silence.
And this is, we were going to talk about that. Unfortunately, we don't have very much time, but this does surprisingly remain an issue. Right. Yeah. The correct way to honor the Israeli athletes who were killed in '72. So
yeah, the IOC is a lot of people think it's the sports version of the UN, and it's not. It's basically a club, like the Augusta National Golf Club down in Georgia. Essentially, it selects its own membership, and there's no rule that, and in fact, many countries are not represented on the committee. And they feel like it would be politicizing the games. And I'm like, guys, that was done about 40 years ago by the terrorists. So,
regardless of, obviously, from an Olympic point of view, regardless of any attitudes about Israeli-Palestinian political questions, there should be little question among Olympians that it's genuinely impermissible to kill Olympians at the games, right? That seems like something that should be obvious to the IOC. But
I would think so too. But I mean, they feel like I'm not going to defend their decision because I don't even understand it. But if this is about the world coming together peacefully and having a moment and putting aside their differences for peaceful competition, and someone violated that, I mean, those individuals were killed because they were athletes, Olympic athletes from Israel. But I mean, that could happen. That's just unacceptable. And a moment of silence is not that big a political gesture, and it's simply a commemoration of people who lost their lives under circumstances that should never be repeated. So,
I think we can agree on that.
Okay.
Anyway, well, this has been a lot of fun. So how about we maybe do this again? I don't know, maybe before the next Winter Olympics. but hopefully
Sounds
before
good.
then. Thank you very much for watching, and hope to see you next week. And enjoy the Olympics.
All right.
See you later, Nick.